Give me a camera to flirt with, an Oscar, I deserve it. The lights, the fame, the press, this game I play it every day.
And hello everyone, it is Peter Sam the Narrow Gauge Engine back again with another edition of Thomas Defended. In this episode we'll be looking at all Brenner era episodes for our 3 choices and identifying the great points about each one while also taking a good look at why they may be so underappreciated. Firstly, we'll be holed up in Didym's sheds with Gordon as we analyse the Frozen Turntable before turning to the skies and take a bird's eye look at what makes Hugo and the Airship so underrated, before ending off by dieseling our way into the last Brenner story for today and numbering things that make Philip's Number an episode in need of more love. With all that said, let's dive on in with the first episode of this lot. The thing I often see when someone in the fandom goes out of their way to speak about the Frozen Turntable is how Gordon's character is exaggerated as he is constantly grumpy and complaining all throughout from start to finish. And guys, I never thought I'd say this, but I agree. To an extent. He is actually like that all the way through, but is this such a bad thing and is it unrealistic? To answer the first question, I don't think so. Having a Gordon complaining and getting his comeuppance episode isn't new by any stretch of the imagination, but it is definitely something that tells us, the audience, that these writers, who are starting this new direction and wave of writing for the franchise, know their stuff and who they're writing for. Let's be fair, even at his worst written, Gordon is still a top tier character because of that fundamental flaw of his own conceitedness and ignorance. This episode captures that beautifully as he is like that the whole way through, and whilst yes, that can be understandably tiring, isn't that kind of the point? This is an entire new wave of kids that these writers are writing for, and they too need to understand the fundamental flaw that Gordon holds, clear as crystal, and get tired of it too, but also be entertained by it, and this is done through the great voice work through every line of dialogue that Gordon has here. This style of episode predates all the way back to season 1, and it's not original at all, but it does reinforce what you know about Gordon and is entertaining whilst doing it. Is this constant grumpy character unrealistic though? I'd argue no. These engines are clearly the closest things to humans in the Thomas universe, besides the humans themselves, and as we are all human, we can all understand that we have bad days, times when we feel nothing but negativity, and personally this is something that has been ever present at various intervals in my life. Bad days happen, and whilst it probably should have been established for the character of Gordon in this episode, the fact that his cross-face isn't the most iconic one for no reason, and due to the other setup needed taking up that expositional time in the episode, maybe it isn't a jump to just make that logical step. So yes, Gordon's childish and a liar for a reason we don't know, but maybe we shouldn't judge, and to be fair, he does get his comeuppance for his poor attitude, so really, there is still that satisfaction of seeing a mean character get slapped round the face with defeat. Finally, I'd like to just go over some other aspects of this episode I like, just because why not? I like that we get to see where all of the engines end up sleeping that night. It doesn't feel like the plot abandons anyone and we know that everyone's sleeping well. This also allows us to see a bevy of fun locations in a way that isn't forced at all, and I love that. As I mentioned briefly back there, Gordon's karma of practically stealing what was agreed to be Percy's by him being trapped in that berth in a "you made your bed so lie in it" moment is incredibly enjoyable. Also, can I just say that every character feels so on point. Thomas and Edward being gracious to let Percy have the berth because Edward's so caring and logical with it, and because Thomas is Percy's best friend. James getting the first berth available to him and kind of agreeing with Gordon that he wants the available berth in Didym's sheds is perfect. Thomas staying with Gordon until last fits with their alliance in season 1. Victor advising Gordon not to stay out in the snow fits well, considering his future episode he stars in. Thomas going to sleep at the Diesel Works reinforces the whole Day of the Diesel's prejudice is put to bed. Stop-o-Mat's quips while disciplining Gordon fits so well with that season 1 and season 2 style of character. Honestly, yes, Gordon probably is the weakest character in this episode because oh my god, there is such strong writing with every other character. Speaking of character, however, it isn't only long-established characters we'll be discussing today, but also the relatively new characters to the franchise, so let's flutter our way over to this rail zeppelin and start talking about the next episode of the 3. Now, to be honest, of all of the episodes I've covered in this series so far, and I know there haven't been many yet, but this one feels like one that suffers from severe and unrelenting underrated syndrome, where no one actually talks about it, and I think people think less of this one because of its protagonist, but when you actually look at it, this bolsters the protagonist into a great character who's easy to root for, and gives us that classic underdog vibe, but pushes it even further. Hugo and the Airship takes this character who was introduced in this very unoriginal way back in Engine of the Future and makes him one of the most sympathetic characters of his era by giving him a great version of that story where an engine feels like they don't fit in. In this episode, the engines mistake Hugo for an air zeppelin flying high in the sky, and they all remark about how much it looks like Hugo, with some hijinks with Percy stemming from it. Hugo starts to feel like he should belong up there with the other zeppelin and feels inadequate, but with encouragement from Skiff, he tries to fly by propelling himself off Gordon's Hill again and again until he can't anymore and returns to Knapford Station and accidentally leaving his propeller spinning whilst entering the platform. When Hugo tells the Fat Controller of his conundrum, he reassures the engine that he's meant to be in the position he's in currently, and then we get this fun bit with Hugo blowing Skiff down the line at the end to cap everything off. Besides the numerous and plentiful comedic slapstick that always hits with this episode, this one has a powerful story. It focuses on how sometimes people feel like they're inadequate or not where they're supposed to be in life, and whilst it maybe could be considered a bit too in your face, the number of situations in my life alone that this could apply to is immeasurable. And if you're someone who cannot relate to this feeling in any way, you should consider yourself a very lucky individual, as I'm sure many can relate to that feeling. Hugo being the protagonist also holds importance, as his previous episode had him feeling this way too because of other engines thinking of him as a threat, whereas now there's this physical representation of an expectation that others believe him to be, and Hugo feels like he needs to live up to that. Which kind of does show that the engines really have accepted him because they have those expectations in the first place. Except James though, little fucking prick. Then we have Hugo's dynamic with Skiff in this episode, and whilst it maybe could have been explored a little more with Hugo possibly envying Skiff's ability to go on rails and in the sea, as it stands it was clear that this was such an intentional choice by the writers, as their interactions feel well written and quite wholesome actually. But it still isn't the best part of this episode despite that. The best part comes when Hugo tries and tries again to meet his ambitions of taking off and flying on Gordon's Hill, the music, the disappointment Hugo feels, Gordon's look as he passes and watches. There's a lot that just feels so powerful emotionally with this one, again tying back to how the moral aspect can hit a lot of people in a lot of ways. Seeing him trying and failing is definitely relatable, and the hard truth of the matter is, Hugo never does succeed at his objective and learns the taste of defeat, so much so that he loses concentration and endangers people, showing how badly it's affected him. But he gains newfound knowledge and insight from that, and that adds a subtle layer of failure being okay for the audience too, and I can appreciate that. In the end, if I could change anything about Hugo and the Airship, maybe I'd add a little more emotional weight to the ending and cut out Skiff's inclusion in the scene, as well as making Hugo seem more jealous of Skiff. Other than that, this episode really does do an extremely good job with its morals and just how relatable it is, and how that extends onto Hugo, turning him from a forgotten character to one that I think is more memorable and can hang with the greats of this era, like Steven and Gator. Speaking of characters born from this era of the show, we still have one more episode to look at, as well as a number dangerously close to the funny number. Let's have a look at it. I'm not so sure what the general fan consensus is with this one, and I'd argue it's probably one that's extremely divisive with how it presents itself and its protagonist. Either way, no one really talks about Philip's number, and it upsets me because it does so much and does it all extremely well, making one of the best episodes from the Best Brenner season in my opinion. Let's start at the start. The intro is a bit cliche, just listing off which engines have which numbers in the main fleet. F's in the chat for Emily, please. But when you see how smoothly everything is animated and how the camera pans, it's beautiful, and this is something we see a lot of in this episode. Great animation, coupled with stellar cinematography and editing. Sure, it really is nonsensical, but because this is clearly not reality, judging by how lackadaisical Philip is whilst the trucks are backflipping and footballers are flying, I'm inclined to get over it and appreciate the efforts the crew are going to when telling us what's going on inside this guy's head. It's a never before seen method of translating what's happening to the audience, and a pretty good one at that, as it perfectly captures Philip's childlike wonder, pondering the meaning behind his assigned number at first before really just going all out and fixating on what all numbers mean. Now, IRL, Philip's assigned number, 68, is obviously a representation of how he's the 68th engine to be introduced into the show, but there is an in-universe answer to it as well, and this was uncovered by Sir Topham Hatt at the end of the episode, and just before the big reveal, Philip stops him and says the answer doesn't bother him anymore. Why is this? Well, in prior scenes, Philip rescued 68 sheep from being turned into mutton chops by Gordon and therefore uses that as the answer as to why that is his number. First time watching this, I was kinda mad I got cheated out of an answer, but upon rewatch, this is actually so satisfying. Philip was obsessing over this so much that he imagined 67 clones of himself, and for him to take that and take his rescue and turn those both into a positive outcome that builds upon his character is amazing. Let's be realistic here, the answer probably would have been the 67 brothers or something, or he was built in 1968, hence the number. This way, it's all of Philip's accord and cements him as less of a passive character than he may have been previously. In his 2 season 19 episodes, he didn't really get all that much development, and more so acted as the tool that humiliated the big engines, but here he is centre stage and the attention is solely on him. What's also clever is the fact that the pacing of this episode matches Philip's energy, and they go partly hand in hand. Philip is an engine who darts about and is very lively, so the narrative adapts to that and reflects it. One minute he's at Knapford, then the Steamworks, then the Diesel Works. We get a lot of locations here and a lot of side characters too. Toby, Gordon, Paxton, Sydney, Victor, all are characterised rather well too. Aside from that genius, there are other little hints of brilliance throughout. Now, I'm not saying this is intentional, but it's definitely a cool little thing I noticed when watching the scene between Philip, Gordon and Thomas at the start, and how it weirdly feels like the opening scene of Tatma between Thomas and Gordon. The mention of how Gordon is practicing his numbers by Thomas fits the overall plot of the episode, and Gordon does mention being late in both. Plus the third character on the middle track in both is what gets the plot moving for the first time, Diesel 10 in Tatma and Philip in this episode. The reference here is a nice little hint from the writers that this episode is going to get weird and wacky. That being said, it could just be me overthinking, but who knows at the end of the day. Lee Pressman, I require confirmation on this. Imagine if he does comment. Actually, Mr. Pressman, if you are here and watching this, a big welcome to you, and I shake you warmly by the hand. Also, where you been? Philip's number's best scene though, without a doubt, is that scene where Gordon almost becomes Hannibal Lecter and silences those lambs. The close-ups with the heightened sound of Gordon's pistons pumping are so well constructed, like holy shit, this is cinematic. And sure, we have seen this plot point before in episodes like Slow Steven, the best Brenner episode in my opinion, but it's clear they strive to improve it because of the aforementioned aspects and how the braking segment where the two characters almost collide but don't is reduced heavily. It's so overdone, I'm so glad they stopped doing that, even if it was right at the end. Philip's Number is a delightfully creative and well-constructed episode that you will not waste your time on because it develops upon characters, previously established and reused plot points, it entertains you, and it even does some neat foreshadowing, maybe. I'm sure this isn't everyone's cup of tea in the fandom and that's fine, but if you were interested in what I had to say, definitely give it a go because it won't leave you disappointed in the slightest. And we've come to the end of the second Thomas Defended episode. Today we've had a pretty big focus on characters, whether they ought to be represented in the way they sometimes are, their struggles and inner turmoil, and their psyche and how they can come back from those struggles. If you want to see more, be sure to give the first episode a look if you haven't already, and there's always some other stuff on the channel that you can watch too if you feel so inclined. But until next time, I've been Peter Sam, you've been you, and you know what? I want to know why I'm number 4. What's the deep significance? Even before I was on the Scarloey, that was my number. Let me look it up. Rigidity, stubbornness, and lack of creativity? Those cheeky fuckers giving me that. Bye-bye.